Thank you, Randy. That was some enjoyable and interesting singing, wasn't it? Yes. See, we have a soul, but we kind of struggle with the soul part, having soul, So, all right, it is good to see you. Glad that you are with us this evening. Welcome to those that have joined us online. I hope that you enjoyed this summer day in November. That's all right. It's a changing in just the next couple of days, all right? But it is good to see you. All right, so let's take our study guides, if you have your outline, your Bibles. And so we're coming to the latter part of the book of Judges. We're really in the last section of the book of Judges, chapter 17 through 21. Here's the interesting thing is that we will not be talking about any other judges in the book of Judges. We've covered all of them. Samson's the last one recorded in the book of Judges. Now, he's not the last of the judges, but he's the last of the judges of which is recorded in the book of Judges. Can you tell me who the last judge was? And I'll give you a couple of hints. He's the author of the book of Judges, the likely author, and he is a prophet. Samuel. Samuel is the last of the judges, all right? So we come to chapter 17 through 21. So what we have in chapter 17 through 21 basically are two accounts. One account is in chapters 17 and 18. The other is chapters 19 through 21. But what we have are two accounts. I guess you could sort of liken chapters 17 through 21 as the postlude of a book, summing it up, an appendix, making commentary. And so here's what it is. Here's what's going on. What Samuel does with these chapters is he gives us two accounts, one in chapters 17 and 18, the other in chapters 19 through 21, that reflect for us the spiritual, moral depravity that existed in Israel at the time. That's basically the best way to describe it. So he's brought us through the Judges, and now he's kind of given us a little bit more commentary just to kind of help us understand just how bad it was in Israel. So when we come to chapter 17 and 18, we're going to be talking about Micah's idolatry. Okay, a man by the name of Micah, not the prophet, not the minor prophet Micah, but a man that we find here by the name of Micah. So here's the first thing what we want to talk about as we get into the study is Micah's shrine for his idols. He builds this idol, this shrine, but there's some developments before we get there. So beginning in verse number 1, here's what we read. It says, "Now there was a man from the mountains of Ephraim, whose name was Micah," and on the map, Ephraim that thing does that every single time. There, it's back on. All right, see, it's working there, Tom. Now it's on. All right, we're on. Hopefully we're on. Okay. All right. Sorry about that there. Where was I? I'm not touching Ephraim. And because what happens there, I think probably all this takes place in the eastern part of Ephraim's my point, what I'm doing, okay? So here's the thing. Here's an interesting thing. So as we go along, it's kind of interesting to know and understand Micah's name. You got to understand now, he's Jewish. He's an Ephraimite, okay? His name is Micah, and his name means Yahweh is incomparable, or Yahweh the incomparable. You could also phrase it like this. It's another way of saying, who is like the Lord? And so, well, the answer to that is nobody. There's nobody that compares to God. There's nobody like God. So that's his name. So it's just interesting that here we got a guy with this name, and yet he does what he does, and yet he's also a Jew. But we're seeing the compounding of Israel's failure over the years, as we've talked about this many times, to have cleansed the land of the pagan influence, all right? So it goes on and says this, and he said to his mother, the 1,100 shekels of silver that were taken from you. So obviously mom had 1,100 shekels of silver. They disappeared. On which you put a curse, even saying it in my ears. So in other words, he says, look, Mom, your silver went missing. You put a curse on that silver, or whoever got the silver. I heard it with my own ears, okay? But then he says, and here is the silver with me. In other words, Mom, I'm the one that took your silver. And his mother, may you be blessed by the Lord, my son. And of course, this cursing stuff was more of a matter of superstition with them than anything else. And yet you see this idea of cursing and blessing of the Lord intermingled here. And there are just some contradictory things that they're saying and doing as we make our way through this. So here's an interesting thing. So 1,100 shekels of silver. Pretty considerable sum of money. We'll see a little bit later on in chapter 17, in verse number 10, that 10 shekels of silver would be equivalent to a year's wage. Okay? So you just imagine 1,100, that's quite a bit of money. Verse number 3. So when he had returned the 1,100 shekels of silver to his mother said, now listen to this, I had wholly dedicated the silver from my hand to the Lord. Now notice something. In the text, you got to understand, she's saying, I had dedicated this silver to Yahweh. Because notice, Lord is spelled all uppercase letters. So that's an indication of where God's perfect covenant name appears in the Hebrew. So I have dedicated this silver to Yahweh, but look at what purpose she had dedicated it for. To make a carved image and a molded image. Boy, you see major contradictions going on right here? I've dedicated this silver to Yahweh to make a carved image and a molded image. Now, there's some disagreement. What she may have had in mind is that there might have been a carved image that was covered with silver, or it may have been two separate images, all right? But either way, she's dedicated this money to Yahweh, the God of Israel, to have an idol made, okay? So it goes on and says, now therefore, I will return it to you. And so basically, he confesses, I've got your money, Mom. The long and the short of it, he gives the money back to her. Then we read verse 4. Then he returned the silver to his mother. And his mother took 200 shekels of silver and gave them to the silversmith. And he made it into a carved image and molded image, and they were in the house of Micah. So she goes through with taking some of that money, having this idol or idols made, but it's money, she says, she has dedicated to Yahweh, and yet there's an idol being made out of it. And it may be, so here's another thing you got to think about. It may be that this idol or idols were to represent some of the pagan fertility gods that were common in Canaan, like Baal or Ashtaroth, okay? But there's another possibility of what they may be doing here, and as we go through, I think this is probably the more likely piece, that what they're actually doing is having this idol made, but worshiping it as a representative of Yahweh. You ever heard of that before? You know of any place where that occurs in the Bible? Remember when Israel was in the wilderness, foot of Mount Sinai, Moses is up on the mountain, and he lingers up there. People down in the valley at the foot of the mountain are saying, hey, wait a minute, where's this Moses at? We don't know if he's coming back, blah, blah, blah. And they start talking about going back to Egypt, and they're complaining to Aaron. And so what does Aaron tell them to do? Pull off the golden earrings. And he says to Moses, when Moses comes down and finds them that they're worshiping this golden calf, he says they pulled off their earrings and they threw them into the fire, and out comes this golden calf. But after that golden calf suddenly appeared as he proposed to Moses, he said to them, "Hear, O Israel, is your God." God. They were using that golden calf as a likeness to represent Yahweh, in which God had said to Moses very, very clearly in the mountain, given the 10 Commandments, you shall make no graven image, you will not worship a graven image, and you're not to worship a graven image that represents me. And yet that's exactly what they did. And so there's very good possibility that's what was going on here. And as we make our way through this, I think it becomes clear to me that's exactly what they had in mind, okay? But here's one of the things that ought to catch your attention. These are Jews. And yet notice how easily that Micah and his mother both move into this and do it. I mean, it's kind of like it doesn't seem strange or unfamiliar to them at all. And they just move very easily into doing this thing. And so that just simply shows how spiritually confused and corrupted that Israel has become. Verse number 5 says this: Then Micah had a shrine, and made an ephod and household idols, and he consecrated one of his sons who became his priest. All right, so he makes a shrine, which is basically like he has created some sort of a room, a building, some location, and it's a place where they're going to come to worship, and they're going to bow down and worship these idols and so forth, where he and others can come in and do, all right? And not only that, but notice what else he does. He makes an ephod. Well, an ephod rather. And what it was, that was garments which the Levitical priest wore at the tabernacle. So he's got this idol who I believe that they were, now the text doesn't come out and just blatantly say it, but I think it's the inference is there, that they're going to worship as if it is a representative or an image of Yahweh, okay? He's got an ephod that his son, and by the way, and he also makes his own son a priest. So look at what he's doing. He is replacing the tabernacle, the place that God has said, this is where you will come and worship me and offer your sacrifices and so forth and so on. But he said, no, I'm not. So he has created and built this rival place of worship to God's appointed place of worship, the tabernacle. And so he consecrates one of his sons as a priest. So he's got his own priesthood now. And the thing that stands out about this is where did this originate from? Where did this come from? Did this come from God? Did this come from him? Is this God originated or man originated? Is it God-centered or man-centered? Every bit of it. And so the purpose of it all was to serve and please man himself and not God. Now, that's a critical point that we need to stop and think about for just a minute. Because here's a question that we have to ask. How guilty are we of doing similar things today? How likely or how common is it that we end up taking the church and turn it into what we think it ought to be, or what culture says it ought to be, or to try to accommodate the culture, rather than to do what we're supposed to do, which is to worship and serve God? Do you think church ever becomes man-centered? Yeah, it does. Think about the other ways that we fall into idolatry. I mean, my goodness gracious, we live in the most materialistic culture that probably has ever been on the face of the planet. Think about that. Our fascination with materialism, material things, money, houses, clothes, our toys, all these different kinds of things. Think about being just pleasure-oriented. We live in a pleasure-oriented culture. I think somebody said something about self. Okay? That's basically what it is. Self. Pleasing self. And by the way, we Christians, oftentimes we can be as guilty of that sometimes as non-believers. How about this? Pleasing others over God. Anybody here ever been guilty of that? And then just as sort of a general description of what Paul talks about, and he talks about and covetousness, which is idolatry. So we fall into these traps too if we're not careful. So that section deals with Micah and his shrine and his idols. Now, it doesn't end there. There's more. There's a lot that happens. When we get into chapter 18, we're going to touch a little bit on chapter 18 tonight, but you'll see how this stuff spreads, okay? But then here's an interesting statement. In verse number 6, now here's a statement that you've heard. It talks about the spiritual state of Israel being summarized. Here's a statement that you're very familiar with from the book of Judges. Most of the time when this statement is quoted, it's quoted from the last part of chapter 21. But here's what most people don't realize. This statement occurs multiple times in the last 5 chapters of the book of Genesis. Samuel is trying to make a point. And here's what he says. In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. Multiple times as we work our way through chapter 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, that phrase is going, it's a refrain. It's kind of like the chorus on a song. You sing the verses, but you always go back to the chorus, okay? This refrain happens over and over again as we make our way through these verses right here. And so it's an assessment of what was wrong with Israel during this time of the judges. He says there was no king in Israel. No, there was not a physical king, but let me ask you a question. Was there not a king of Israel? Yes. And they rejected him in the wilderness? Kind of recouped the new generation that was with Joshua and went in and conquered the land? But then after Joshua dies, we fall into this era of the judges, and it's like they have rejected God as king once again. And then we're going to end up in the book of Kings, where God says, okay, you want a king? I'll give you a king, but here's how it's going to go. And so they're choosing a human king over the king. And so, yeah, there was a king, but so they were just completely ignoring God's will and his rule over their life. And here's what they were doing. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. Absolutely. Radical, it was their radical individualism to assert their will and their way in rebellion against the Lord as their God and their king. And you're right, exactly. That's exactly what we've got going on. You know, the Bible says this. Listen, the Bible says in Proverbs 14:12, there is a way that seems right to man. Everyone did what was what? Right in his eyes. Boy, this is the way that's right to me. There's a way that seems right to man, but the end of it is death. Its way is death, destruction. And so what happens is that when we merely follow our instincts and our impulses apart from the redeemed new nature that Christ puts in us, I'm telling you, we're just setting ourselves up for trouble. And so that what Don just mentioned a minute ago, that is today, contemporarily, it is relativism. It is situational ethics. I remember back in the 1980s, that was kind of the word, situational ethics. It's kind of the same old thing. You just do what feels right to you in any given situation because there is no absolute truth. It's just whatever works for you in a situation, do it. That's your truth, okay? Do what feels right to you. There are no absolutes. And here, I will throw this one out here. Here's one for our current decade. I think we could probably call it progressivism. Because progressivism wants to throw the baby out with the bathwater and everything is right and nothing's wrong. Unless they disagree with it. Right? Someone said this, modern culture regards this as the ideal state of society. We're living in an era where we can see the absolute truth of that statement right there. The progressives of our culture, modern culture, regards this as the ideal state of society. Yet the Bible and common sense tells us that this kind of moral, spiritual, and social anarchy brings nothing but destruction. Here's some examples. It seemed right to the eyes of Adam and Eve to eat the forbidden fruit. God said it was wrong. All of humanity suffered ever since. It seemed right to the eyes of to the sons of Jacob to sell Joseph into slavery. God said it was wrong. It seemed right in the eyes of Abraham and Sarah to have a child through Hagar. But it was completely a violation of God's plan. And the world's been paying for that ever since. Thus, our contemporary situation that we're dealing with over in Israel right now goes all the way back to the birth of Ishmael, where Abraham and Sarah thought they had a better plan than God. It seemed right in the eyes of Nadab and Abihu to offer strange fire before the Lord, but God said it was wrong, and he killed them. It seemed right in the eyes of David to commit adultery with Bathsheba and cover it with murder. God said it was wrong. David suffered greatly as a result of that, and so did Israel. It seemed right in the eyes of Judas to betray Jesus. But from a human perspective, that was a wrong decision. From God's perspective, it was a wrong decision. It was betrayal. That's why he's called the son of perdition. So we get back to Micah. All right, so we've got that interlude, that summarization of the condition of Israel, but then we get back to Micah. And here's the thing that we discover about Micah, and he decides to upgrade his priesthood. He's appointed a son as priest, all right? And as you move on through this, you'll see the reason why I believe that they were intending to worship those idols that had been consecrated to the Lord. See, if you think about it, that makes sense. I've consecrated this to the Lord to have these idols made. Why? Because I'm going to honor him with these idols, okay? So you see how I think that plays out as we go along. So it goes on and says this, says, now there was a young man from Bethlehem in Judah, of the family of Judah. He was a Levite. Now take note of that, all right? He was a Levite and was staying there. And the man departed from the city of Bethlehem in Judah to stay wherever he could find a place. Now listen, here's what's going on. This guy's a Levite. He's a part of the priesthood, the lineage of the Levites, of the priesthood, and so forth and so on, the servants of the tabernacle, okay? Why is he out looking? Here's what he's doing. He's looking for an opportunity, is what he's doing. He's traveling around. He's looking for the right opportunity. And you know, to some degree, as long as God's leading and we don't violate any of God's principles, there's nothing wrong with that, going out looking for the right kind of opportunity and stuff, as long as God gives us the permission to do so and we don't violate his will and so forth. But that's not what this guy's doing. And so he went to stay wherever he could and find a place, and then he came to the mountains of Ephraim, to the house of Micah, as he journeyed. Now, so here's something that we've got to kind of keep in mind. Think about this Levite. Why would he need to be out looking for a place? With him being a Levite. All right, so we covered this when we went through the book of Joshua. Remember when they conquered the land, the conquest of the land? And God gave allotments to all these different tribes and so forth. Remember that? But he says, I am not giving an allotment to Levi. Remember that? But what did he give to the Levites? Remember all those Levitical cities all throughout? That's where the Levites were to live, and they were to serve there in their community, and then they would have their opportunity to go and to serve in the tabernacle in whatever capacity that they would be called upon. There were various levels of it, of how they might serve in the tabernacle and so forth. He didn't need to go find a place. He had a place. He had a calling. He had a God-given responsibility. But he was not content with what God had given him. So here's what he's doing. He's out marketing his position as a Levite to the highest bidder. He's looking for somebody like Micah. Okay? And so he came to the house of Ephraim. That's where their paths crossed. And it was not a good thing. Satan, you just know Satan was all over this thing. Okay? All right, look at verse number 9. And Micah said to him, where do you come from? And so he said to him, I am a Levite from Bethlehem in Judah, and I am on my way to find a place to stay. Interpretation, I'm looking for an opportunity. Okay? Micah said to him, dwell with me and be a father and a priest to me, and I will give you 10 shekels of silver per year. So we made reference to that a few minutes earlier, okay? I'll give you a suit of clothes and your sustenance. And so the Levite went in, and then the Levite was content to dwell with the man, and the young man became like one of his sons to him. So basically, what he did was, he hired this Levite to be his priest. This guy's a legit Levite. He is a descendant of Levi, okay? He's got the credentials of being a Levite and serving the tabernacle and so forth. So Micah sees that and he jumps on it because you know what he does? That, in his eyes, legitimizes all this other stuff he's doing that is completely contrary to what God has intended. Maybe he was aware that his idols and that his ephod that he was wearing and his son who's serving his, that all of this was really not what he ought to be doing, that was contrary to God's will. And so by getting this Levite, oh boy, this legitimizes what I'm doing. Yeah. And so this was, it's like Micah, this was Micah's pitch to this Levite. I've got an itch and I need you to scratch it. I've got itching ears and I need you to scratch my ears with what I want to hear. Reminds me of what Paul wrote. 2 Timothy chapter 4, verses 1 through 5. Here's what Paul said to Timothy. I charge you in the presence of God and of Christ Jesus, who is to judge the living and the dead, and by his appearing in kingdom, preach the word, be ready in season, out of season, reprove, rebuke, and exhort with complete patience and teaching. Listen to this, verse 3. For the time is coming when people will not endure sound teaching, but having itching ears, they will accumulate for themselves teachers to suit their own passions, and will turn away from listening to the truth and wander off into myths. The reality is what Paul's writing to Timothy has been around for a long time. It's just going to increase as we get closer to the end. So we go on and we read, and it says, so Micah consecrated the Levite. Now think about that, all right? Think about that statement. Micah consecrated the Levite. What authority did he have to consecrate a Levite? None. What authority did he have to commission anyone to serve in the priesthood? None. Absolutely none. He's an apostate. And the young man became his priest and lived in the house of Micah. Then Micah said, now I know that the Lord will be good to me, since I have a Levite as a priest. He thought he was set.
What happened to his son, the priest?
He got booted. He got demoted. You're out. Sorry, son, I got a new son. So his confidence was just as false and misguided as this whole consecration thing. None of it was based on God's will or God's word. Now, so that's into chapter 17. So we're going to hit the first part of chapter 18. We'll wrap it up right here. But here's what I want to mention, that Micah's idolatry spreads. That's the problem with stuff like this. It spreads. It says this, in those days there was no king in Israel. And you could go ahead and follow that through, and people did what was right in their own eyes. And in those days, the tribe of the Danites, all right, remember I talked about the Danites just below Ephraim here, over there towards the west, towards the Mediterranean Sea, in that golden area right there. That's where their original allotment was given to them by Joshua, okay? So the Danites were seeking an inheritance for itself to dwell in. Why would they be seeking for an inheritance to dwell in? They've got one. But the Danites are out looking for a new place. Why? We'll talk about that in just a minute. For until that day, their inheritance among the tribes of Israel had not fallen. What does that mean? It means they had been too cowardly and too weak to do what God had told them to do. Remember, Israel goes in, they make the original conquest of the land. Then the allotment of the land is given to the tribes. And Joshua says, now you must go into your allotment and you need to finish the conquest. And whatever's left of the Canaanites, drive them out. The Danites didn't do anything. In fact, here's what we read. In Judges chapter 1, we saw this in Judges, but you don't see the full result of it until now. in Judges chapter 1, verses 34 and 35 says this. And the Amorites forced the children of Dan into the mountains. So this is what happened not long after they got their land, okay? The Amorites drove the children of Dan into the mountains, for they would not allow them to come down to the valley, and the Amorites were determined to dwell in Mount Heres, Aijalon, Shalabim, which is all in Dan. And yet when the strength of the house of Joseph became greater, they were put under tribute. So basically, here's what happened with Dan after they moved into their land. The Canaanites said, you ain't coming down here, and they drove them into the mountains, and they had to live up in the mountains. They never got to enjoy the land that God had given them. Okay? And they ended up paying tribute. Okay? And now here they are. The situation's so bad, they're going to bail on the original inheritance that God had given to them. So verse number 2 says this. So the children of Dan sent 5 men of their family from their territory, men of valor from Zorah and Eshtaol, to spy out the land and search it. And they said to them, go search the land. And so they went to the mountains of Ephraim, to the house of Micah, and they lodged there. Verse 3. And while they were at the house of Micah, they recognized the voice of the young Levite. Boy, isn't that a coincidence? They turned aside and said to him, who brought you here? What are you doing in this place? What do you have here? And he said to them, thus and so Micah did for me. He has hired me. I have become his priest. Now listen to hear what they did. Now when you think about the fact that they were so weak and cowardly that they let the Amorites drive them out of their inheritance, look at this response. So they said to this Levite, please inquire of God that we may know whether the journey on which we go will be prosperous. They should have known better not to ask that Levite to intercede on their behalf. And yet they're as blind as Micah and the Levite and the whole thing. And this heading says, Micah's idolatry spreads. This is just the start of it. It spreads even more than this, okay? All right, we're going to conclude right there. Any questions? Comments?
Just coincidence that the pieces of silver was the same for Delilah and over here, 1100?
I hadn't even picked up on that, to be honest with you, Ron. Good observation. I don't know. What it tells me is those pagans had money. They had money to bribe with. All right, anybody else?
In reading this, it reminds me a lot of the mistake that we still make to this day, and that's with the silver idols, is trying to set our own standard of what worship should be. It kind of reminds me of Cain and Abel, where God set a standard, this is what I want you to do, and Cain thought it was acceptable to do his own thing. And then, that's kind of the same thing that's happening with this idol, is he knows what he's supposed to do, but he's choosing to do it his own way and not live up to God's standard.
Yeah, that's a habit that affects human beings when it comes to the worship of God. We want to fashion it for our purposes and in our image and our convenience, as opposed to what God expects and what he wants from us. All right, thank y'all so much for being with us tonight and for the questions. I'm going to turn it over to Brother Randy. Ha, ha, ha. Thank y'all for joining us online.